welcome to this, the final webinar in our series of 5 about how we can transform who we are and hopefully transform the world we live in by telling a better human story. Can't quite believe that we've got to number 5 already. For us, it's whizzed by, and I hope it has for some of you too. And welcome to all those who are coming in for the first time or have joined us halfway through. As you know, you can catch up with everything on YouTube as well. Most of you will know me. I'm Jane Moat. I worked at the BBC. I'm a journalist, and I'm hosting tonight's event, trying to keep things moving along. But Viv Ducey is really the person who's holding everything together, and she'll ensure that your questions are answered where possible and that we cover everything. So Viv, do you want to just explain the process for tonight?
Hello everybody. Hi, I'm Viviane Ducey, and I must say we've had connection over the 5 webinars with something in the order of 150 people. So that is astonishing, and we really appreciate everybody booking in and coming in on time. It really is very helpful. And in fact, we learned today, I think we've got people from Oregon, we've got people from South Africa, and of course in England, Norfolk, Wales, and across the southeast of England. Very much hope that people will continue the conversation after today. So you know our email address, so just keep connected with us. It'd be really good to hear from you. And very welcome to everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, Viv. And yes, we're throwing the floor open tonight. It's a free-for-all, which could work. It might not work. Who knows? You've got to take risks in life. And you've had so many good comments to make that we really wanted you to have a chance to ask Paul and Tony, our speakers, questions directly, and also be able to talk amongst yourselves. We've got such an interesting group of people on board here tonight. You know Paul, who's an author, environmentalist, and an academic, and Tony, who's an ecologist and also president of Sussex Wildlife Trust. You've met them before, and we're going to hear from them in a minute. But just to remind you, if you stay on mute when you're not talking, if we come to you, please just unmute yourself. If there's a bit of a delay, don't worry. Keep your videos on if you feel like us doing so. It's nice to see you. And if you're not, if you're putting questions in chat, we'll be keeping an eye on those. If you want to raise your hand physically or using the Zoom tools, that's great as well. But you know, the main point of tonight is to make sure that we culminate all the thoughts and ideas that we've had in a good old question time. So before we get going, and just to warm you up a bit, we're going to get Paul and Tony to kick off with a few thoughts of their own, but they're only allowed 3 minutes, so we're going to preserve lots of space for you. And I'm in this spirit of democracy, I'm going to say, Paul, Tony, who wants to go first?
Well, shall I kick off? Will that help?
Go on.
I shall jump in and go first then. 3 minutes, gosh, how am I going to do that? Well, a few points and see how far I get. I think the key thing I want to lead on is the concept of urgency. You know, time isn't on our side, things are very urgent. And if we can have a look at the first slide, I think the way to actually demonstrate this best is by looking at what are called the mitigations curves for the speed that we're going to have to decarbonize our society. And if you look at this, the steepness of the graph, that shows how quickly we're going to have to bring our carbon emissions down. Essentially, we've got to get down to near zero by 2030, 2040. If we just carry on with our existing budget, we'll use it all up in 8 years. So look at the steepness of that graph. Look how steep it actually gets. If we'd have actually started in the year 2000, we could have gone on a nice, slow, gentle decline. But instead, we have left this incredibly late. Can I see the next slide? What I've done here is just to kind of give an idea of how I see the way we've left this so late has affected us. If we'd have started in the 1990s like we said we would, we could have slowly changed our economy and actually got to a new state relatively quickly and without too much change. But as we've ignored this problem and just carried on emitting, the steepness of the curve has got worse and worse, and now we're in a phase where we're looking at disruption. So to actually get down to to enough, keeping the carbon in the right place so we can maintain only 1.5 degree rise in temperature, we are looking at disruptive change in the next few years. And if we don't achieve that, then we go to the next bit, which is actually catastrophic change. If we don't do something within the next 5 to 10 years, then we'll be doing something incredibly quickly after the next 10 years. Now this is, and bear in mind, the initial figure on this is to give us a 66% chance of keeping below 1.5 degrees. So, would you get on an aeroplane if you had 66% chance of it surviving? So this really captures the urgency. We have got to get these carbon emissions down. That's just climate change, climate emergency. But we could have similar figures when it comes to looking at ecological catastrophe as well. So that's what I want to leave with, is this sense of urgency. Then the key points come out that we've been talking about before. There's something in our human story, the way we actually conceive ourselves. We are part of nature. This is not something that's happening to somewhere else. This is happening to the life support systems that we rely on. We are part of nature. We have to think about that and think about the depth of that. We have to think about connection to nature and connection to each other. So that's the next point I want to make. Third point, regeneration. So, we realize that we're connected to nature, so things we do now will have to be regenerative. We can't just get away with damaging things less. That's what I've been doing for the last 30 years. Hasn't done very well. We've got to regenerate nature. So everything we do has got to be regenerative. And in my mind, some of my last points, within my 3 minutes, I hope, is that I think the area where this makes most sense is locally. What you do and the implications of what you do and the stake in the area, makes most sense locally. But actually keying that in with kind of global responsibilities and looking after the global commons. So think global, act local. We've heard that before.
Well, it is your 3 minutes, and you're right at that cliff edge. And I don't think that graph is going to disappear from people's minds. So we're going to refer back to that, I think, as the sessions go on. So the question is, Paul, can you stick to your 3 minutes?
I'll do my best. So a few years ago, a group of environmental communication experts at Yale University were asked to come up with a simple phrase which really summed up the climate catastrophe that we're facing. Something that was simple and memorable. And they came up with 10 words, and I'd really hope that we can all learn these. If we can put them on the chat there, that would be great. And it's real, it's us, it's bad, scientists agree, there's hope. So let's just quickly look at that. I think we all know it's real. We all know it's bad. If COVID-19 is like a bad gale, we are facing a Category 5 hurricane if we don't rapidly change our ways. Scientists agree. There's very little in science that has nearly 98% agreement amongst experts and amongst scientists. But there's hope. And that's what I really want to focus on. The fact is, we've caused the problem. It's really us that's caused the problem, and we have to change our lifestyle significantly in every respect. But the whole idea of your better nature is that there's a better way of living, but it's not about wearing hair shirts. There is a better way built around our real authentic needs, not our pseudo needs, built around our needs for health, education, citizenship, finding meaning, being part of a community, living a fulfilling life, as opposed to just acquiring more stuff or getting that quick fix or just that sense of instant gratification. There is a path forward. I talked a lot about voluntary simplicity, and probably of all the books I've mentioned in the webinar, that's where I would really focus. But ultimately, the only way we're going to bring about change is by changing at every level, at individual level, at community, family level, but we also have to get out and work at regional, national and international level. We can't just buy electric cars. We can't just put solar panels on our roof. We have to go out and be active citizens, lobby people, make changes through what we buy and what we don't buy, and really develop what we talked about in an earlier webinar, this idea of shifting from being consumers to being citizens and being contributors. That's really the biggest message I want to get across in these webinars. So there you go.
Thank you, Paul. And I'm glad that the last 2 words were "there's hope," or is that 3? I don't know, because we wouldn't be doing this if there wasn't hope, and we wouldn't be doing this if we didn't think that we can change the narrative. We're going to start by just looking at that narrative. And by the way, I've got preset questions from some people who've written in, but if you've got other questions you want to throw in, I'm keeping an eye on chat as well. So do feel free to add those in. But we're going to start with our human story. You know, we're talking about our new human story and what we want from it. And one of the things that you were just referring to there, Paul, you're using different language. And language matters so much. I think we did a poll in one of these webinars, and we put one of the options for things that you're most worried about to be climate change. Now, we'd already decided that we should never say climate change. We should always say climate breakdown, because change sounds nice and simple and soft, and it's not soft. We've seen the cliff that we had in Tony's chart. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the language of stories. And Keith Oldham, it works for an Interfaith Earthkeepers, and he's used lockdown to start compiling a dictionary to look at what sort of language we could use more usefully. Keith, are you there? And would you be able to come on and ask a question about that?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good. Yes, I've been fascinated by, language and terminology, and started coming up, and I initially called it, Drawdown Glossary for the Anthropocene. And I started using these words, and some people totally understood what I meant by drawdown, and some people were familiar with Anthropocene, and others it was just like, what are you talking about? I talk about carbon sequestration, and they still weren't sure. And so then I was exploring different ways of articulating, what is a glossary or a dictionary for our time that encompassed, transformation, resilience, regeneration. And these are the kinds of sort of new key words, I think, that are exciting. And I'm also sort of interested, there's a lot of homeschooling, and I've got a lot of school teachers, and beginning to think about how we translate this adult language into language that is appropriate and available to the youth.
So did you have a question for Tony?
Okay. Well, so my question to you is, part of it is to crowdsource and to share what are your keywords or key phrases that I could begin to start putting down into this glossary. There's a succinct question. Finally.
That's great. Paul, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, I think language is incredibly important, and I think it was last year, The Guardian did something very interesting. They started to stop using the word climate change and start using climate breakdown. And they started to change some of the other words, use global heating rather than global warming. And I think that it's essential we get the right language across. I've always had a real problem with the word sustainability. It's a very insipid word. It's not exciting, but part of the problem with ecology, the environment, is there's a sort of dearth of very positive phrases which really sum up where we're going. I mean, I think resilience is a great word, but in the field of psychology, we had this problem as well, because most of the terminology was what's wrong with you, depression, anxiety, all the disorders. But we've had to develop words like thriving and flourishing and wellness. And I think flourishing is a word I particularly like, but I think it's great to have this discussion, both for us and also, I agree, in environmental education for children. And it should be a positive sense of where we're moving to, not just what we're moving away from.
And Tony, what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, it's very interesting, because words are very important, and I think we all say that, but actually, if you choose the right words, it frames the whole discussion. The most important thing is actually the discussion you have as a result of those words. So how you go into it is very important. That's one side of the equation. I also think there's another side to the equation, and that is, having got a word, you need to make sure it's used correctly. And I think quite often we spend a lot of time going round the houses, reinventing or rediscovering the same word. I'll give an example. Rewilding. I think that's a really valuable word. It's a very positive word about the environment, about regenerating nature, about actually restoring natural processes. But actually in some conservation circles, it's actually very, very controversial, because there's a kind of loose attachment to what it actually means. Yet in my mind, there's a very clear understanding on what rewilding is. It's got the public imagination, it's very positive. So it frames the argument in a particular place. I'll give another example, natural capital. Used badly, that means monetizing nature and selling off things. but we must make it make a phrase that we have. We must make it be used correctly, and that's all about the total stock of nature from which we get benefit. So these phrases are very important. And I think sometimes in language it's from and to, you know, what we did use, which framed an argument in a particular place or framed a discussion in a particular place, like being a consumer. We'll talk about that later. We talk about consumer and consumption, what we can get, then actually the frame is in one place. If you talk about being a citizen, it's about what you can contribute, what happens when it comes to the global commons, which is another phrase I really like. So it frames the argument in a different place. So I think, yeah, the words are important, but having got the words, don't go around the houses too much. If they're being adopted by everybody anyway, then you have to make use of them correctly.
Thank you. Can I just stay with Tony a couple
Sure.
of moments, because we've just had a question from Nicola Peel. Is nature sustainable, or does it thrive?
I don't like the word sustainable either. We've used it all the time. Sustainable. If somebody said, "What's your relationship with your wife like?" and you said and I said sustainable, that would be very good, would it? Sustainable is useful, but I don't like it very much. I think unsustainable is even worse. The true word for unsustainable is temporary. If we actually said something was temporary or it was sustainable, that gives you a better idea. So yes, I mean, I don't like the idea of nature being sustainable. It should be thriving. I completely agree with Nicola. And actually, we're at a stage now where mere sustainability will just, you know, take us to where we don't want to be, i.e. declining nature. It doesn't work like that.
And Sally May was saying biodiversity and biodiversity loss is a critical one to explain.
Yeah, biodiversity is key. Very interesting, because when that word first came out, again, conservationists didn't like it. It's jargon. Nobody would like it. And nobody did like it. But as soon as there were grants for delivering biodiversity, everybody suddenly understood it. So actually, it shows how things can turn around.
Sorry, Paul, I cut you off a bit there.
No, not at all. I think it's particularly important at the moment in terms of social media. I was reading a piece about this recently where, you know, when you're on social media, it's like an echo chamber. You are fed things that you're interested in. And some people, particularly in the States, will get climate hoax come up regularly, which is what Trump's called it. Other people get climate denial. Some people get climate change, and some people, you know, climate catastrophe or emergency. And so words are very, very powerful, and they segment people and they frame the way we see these huge issues. And I think the faster we move to climate breakdown, climate collapse, climate crisis, climate emergency, the better. Because we have, you know, both Tony and I have stressed just how urgent this is, and the language has to reflect that.
And I think that Janet Dillaway is happy with that. Climate emergency is definitely her preference too. Just want to ask a question here from Leanne Webb. Leanne, if you can stand by, I'm going to come to you in a minute. You're part of Sustainable Sussex, and she's very concerned that we're conditioned by language. We're really born with the language that exists. You know, it's something that comes with the world that we're brought into, and then we get numbed by a diet of TV and junk food and things that just lull us into this, you know, comatose sort of world where we're not really testing ourselves. And Leanne, you had a question specifically about how we might change stories.
Yes, thank you. I guess, you know, sort of where I'm coming from is about this idea about our stories and how we create those stories. And to me, it links very much, it starts very much with the sense of our beliefs about ourselves, which I think is very much connected with where we are in our society and culturally. But I suppose the question is about, you know, can we change our stories from the inside by changing our beliefs about ourselves, which could then change our views of those around us and the world we live in. So is there some room where we can kind of share stories of abundance and help people actually create their own stories, changing their beliefs along the way?
Thank you, Leanne. Paul, do you want to start on that?
Well, absolutely, because this is what I write about. It's my work around identifying the stories we tell ourselves, both in a psychological sense, but even more importantly, in terms of your better nature. what we really wanted to focus on in Your Better Nature was not necessarily looking at, you know, what we can do in terms of recycling and all the actions. Those things are available anyway. You know, we're happy to talk about them. But what we really wanted to focus on was changing our fundamental story about who we are and what are our values and why are we here? What's our purpose? And I think the best example of that is when we did the webinar, there's Are You a Consumer or Are You a Citizen? Because really, we are being manipulated from the day we're born to being consumers in the West. And in fact, in almost every country in the world who has bought in, you know, to the neoliberal capitalist system, advertising, marketing, but also the unconscious beliefs that go through, permeate our education, our politics and everything. And it's extremely hard to change your story. Most people don't. Most people, what's called in psychology through confirmation bias, we bolster it, we strengthen it. But most people only change in response to a major event in their life. It could be a tragedy, illness, or going out maybe to a different community and experiencing climate breakdown firsthand. But what we want to do in Your Better Nature is really work with you and help you to change your story from the inside out, as you rightly said. That's the key, because we're only going to bring about the long-term change if we change our values and our beliefs about who we are and what we should be doing on this planet.
Thanks. Tony, did you want to add anything to that? Or
yeah, so just briefly, I mean, for I don't know how many years, whenever I've given environmental presentations, so quickly it comes down to our value system. We start off with a fairly practical, you know, idea about what's wrong with the world, what's right with the world, and what we're going to do about it, and it comes back to our value system. And actually, it's not that difficult to get a discussion which says, well, actually, we need to change our values, and so that's where you need to look. So I think that's one part of it. The other part of it is about being able to shoulder some challenge. Actually, I think many people are quite happy to be challenged in the way they think. That keeps life alive, really, doesn't it? So the whole point about science is actually about skepticism. So the ability to challenge is important, the ability to be challenged and actually think again about things. So I really quite like it when we have to rewrite the ecology books because we've discovered something new. Well, that's a kind of a new story. So I think, yeah, taking some challenge and actually being prepared to look anew is not that unusual.
Well, we're getting a bit of a lively chat on the chat at the moment, so I just have to break in on this one. So Clive Margolis was asking Paul, in terms of personal change, do you think we are suffering from a lack of inspiring leaders? We hear a lot from environmentalists, but not so much from wise people. So Nicola's response, are you saying environmentalists are not wise? I beg to disagree. I can't imagine, Clive. Perhaps you ought to come on and explain yourself first. Clive, do you want to talk up here?
Yes, where would I start? I suppose
briefly. Yeah,
briefly, okay. Where would I finish right now?
Yes,
I'm talking about, I suppose, the who would it be? I don't know, but kind of like spiritual leaders more. People who are not so much, we're being just bombarded with about the environment, and sure, it's a massive problem, but another angle, if you like, would be, you know, where are our wise people, our sort of elders of tradition, you know, to say, well, this is how you should be living your lives. Because I believe, and I really am finishing, I believe that if the balance of our lives is right, then we're partners with nature much more.
So what you meant was not only environmentalists, but people who've got a wider brief.
Of course,
and the two are not incompatible, obviously. So, Paul, can you briefly answer that? Because then we're going to get on to a whole new section.
Sure. Very, very briefly, we're unfortunately living in an age with probably the worst political leadership, certainly in my lifetime, and probably for 100 years. So we can't look to many politicians. There are some remarkable environmental leaders, in my view, even if they're not leaders in terms of position, thought leaders, George Monbiot, Jonathan Porritt, you know, plenty of others. But also, I think there's some really great spiritual leaders. And if you read the works of Joanna Macy in particular, she's been working this field for 50 or 60 years, if you're interested in spiritual matters and eco-spirituality. But it's people in the community. But in terms of political business leaders, traditional, quote, formal leaders, no, very few, I think.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move on a bit because we're going to go from the story to the transformation, the systematic change that we already said needs to happen if we're going to actually move the planet on, move ourselves on. And I want to start by looking to the future with a student, Henry Bushell. It's a 20-year-old student, and he wants to pick up on, I know you've talked about the digital world, Henry, but I want you to ask your question about consumerism, because we've talked a lot about consumerism and the need to move on from that. But his concern is that 20-year-olds who he's mixing with are concerned about clubbing and fashion and all sorts of everyday things, and a program to do that. So he had a question to ask of you. If you're ready, Henry, can you jump in with it?
Yeah. So I'm a university student and surrounded by a lot of young people, and being raised in an era of increasingly digitalized world, and sort of a commercialized world that with conspicuous consumption is quite rife. One of the questions is, I find that at university people are often buying new clothes, they're going to the pub, they're going out. There's all sorts of things which people are doing, and it's very easy to get caught up in this sort of flurry of action. But actually, I'm asking what's the best way, to raise awareness of actually consumerism and like consumption cultures for young people, so that they can engage with like these sort of concepts.
Brilliant, thanks, Henry. Who wants to have a go at that one?
I'll say something brief, if you like, and then leave Paul to come in. Yeah. Just a thought. You're at college for a certain length of time, 3 years if you do a degree, maybe 6 years or more if you do a PhD as well. So that's a relatively short amount of time, and maybe that is the time when you can actually push the edges a bit. And actually, if you go a bit mad, then that's part of the contract, isn't it? That's what you're supposed to do. So I wouldn't worry about it too much. It's actually, you're laying the groundwork for later on. So actually, I'm not terribly concerned if people go a bit mad at university. Maybe that's part of the contract. But actually, it's later on. You're there to challenge. That's the time when you'll be best able to challenge and come up with new ideas. But let's think about the urgency again. I'll keep coming back to this. If you're at college for 3 years, with projections about where we're going to be, when you come out of college, things are going to be pretty dire. If you're there doing a PhD, when you come out in, say, 6 or 8 years' time, there may be no carbon budget left. Things are going to be falling off a cliff. You're going to be left with all the mess that we've created. So that should kind of raise some interest and actually get something going. So I wouldn't worry too much about people appearing to be too kind of commercial at the moment. I think, it's part of laying the groundwork for later on. Also, I think us old fogies worry about digitisation as well, and all the computer stuff taking over. That can be read the other way. Digitisation can actually help to improve your engagement with nature by improving the way you can actually identify things, record things and so on. So there's positives in this as well.
Paul, do you want to pick up?
Definitely. In fact, I was remiss on the previous questions. Of course, the best example of an environmental leader right now is a young person, is Greta Thunberg. And she really has proven that there's a huge groundswell of interest amongst young people around the world. In fact, young people are really pushing the agenda very much. I agree with Tony, but I wouldn't worry too much. As someone who's spent a lot of time at university, both as a student and a lecturer, it is a rite of passage to some extent, living that way. But I feel it's partly about making people more aware. But you could be alive at the end of this century when we might have 2, 3, 10-foot more oceans, we might not be able to be in London. So it really will affect your generation. So it's essential that you're thinking about this. But what I've seen in studies of how you persuade young people is, first of all, understand that people in their 20s are completely different to people of my age or in their 40s. They have very different needs. And the biggest need, I think, is to get people to work together, is work as peers, work as friends, do fun activities, work on short-term goals, and question, why am I buying this? What is the feeling I want? This is a quote. When I work with this question of consumption, I always say to people, what is it that you want to feel through buying this? We all want feelings, and we buy things for the most bizarre reason, and it's that self-awareness is key.
Thanks for that, and loads of good advice coming up in the chat as well. Nicola Peel has pointed out Stacey Dooley's done some great pieces of work on the impacts of fashion. So I suppose if she's a BBC Three presenter, if you know what the impact is, that helps intellectually for people to understand why consumerism might be an issue. And Millie is hoping that you can persuade your fellow students to get out there and spend time in nature, because for all of us, no matter what age, that is an important part of it. Henry, do you want to come back at all on what you've heard and give a response on what you think?
Yeah. I thought, you raised some really interesting points. And I agree, I think it's definitely a point for people to sort of, find out about consumption and how they feel about it. But also I'm just, thinking, there is effectively a time limit, and how long can we sort of experiment and sort of have 3 years just to sort of, see how we feel about consumption, when, as you said, in 5-6 years time, there might not be a climate budget remaining. But yeah, I think it's hard to convey the urgency to a lot of people. But I mean, yeah, it's a battle that I'm trying to fight.
Oh, well done. Good. We need you to. We need you to.
Yeah.
And your generation needs you to as well. Fantastic. Thanks very much, Henry. Very briefly, can I bring Gillian in? Gillian Edam, who's also concerned about how you can get others on board to understand how to combat this need or perceived need for consumerism.
Okay, so my question goes a little bit further than Henry's. I've been thinking about consumerism for about 40 years, and which has driven me to do some slightly weird things. But anyway, so my question is, how can we introduce alternatives to buying new things into the mainstream and encourage people to automatically think of sharing and borrowing and repairing and upcycling as by default, and for this type of behaviour to become a thing? So it's like, then go to the shops, I'm going to see if I can make something out of this old yogurt pot instead, So it's not an automatic thing, I'll go and buy a new one, I'll find another way to fix this or replace it.
Paul, do you want to pick up on that?
Just very quickly, it ties in with some of the other questions, but it's what is your story about the things that you're buying? Because I think one of the most interesting ideas of the circular economy is shifting from ownership to rental. And when we can decouple that sense that I have to own a car, I have to own all these things, and start thinking of renting or borrowing, and seeing that we'll be just as happy and probably more fulfilled in many ways doing it that way. But I think, yeah, that's a big shift, which we're going to see a lot more of in transport, in so many other areas.
It's interesting, isn't it? We're having this discussion about ourselves here in the northern hemisphere, living a very wealthy state. Whatever we have is more than most people in other countries would have put together. Gonzalo Alvarez is here from the UNA, United Nations Association, Climate and Oceans. And I'd like to bring him in on here to just take us a little bit further and look at where people don't have such choices, or where the impact of our choices are impacting, heavily on parts of the world where there's extreme poverty and where people are not consuming as much. Gonzalo, are you there? Would you mind throwing a question in?
Yes, Jane, thank you very much. Hello. Yes, I'm the chairman of the United Nations Association, Climate and Oceans, and building up on that concept of systematic change that has been brought up, I'm also a pragmatist. So concepts are good, but if we look at now at the global stage, Paul was mentioning about the global governance and how badly we're governed at the moment globally, if you were. This is my question, in that kind of context of wealth and wealthier countries and poorer countries, how would a circular economy work in practice in wealthier as well as in poorer countries? Thank you.
So small question, big answer to think of there. I'm going to ask Paul again first.
Well, it's a very good question. So for those of you, just to remind you, the circular economy is this idea of having minimal waste, and that waste becomes an input as like a natural cycle. But it has been something which has become very popular within the EU and other Western countries. But as Gonzalo rightly says, how can it work in developing countries? And I think it can. You know, in India and other places, they went straight from no communications infrastructure to mobile and cellular. They just missed out landline. And I think there are large parts of the world right now, and especially I think at this time when people are looking at changing everything, building back better, to use that wonderful phrase, it's a great time to work with developing countries to really experiment with these new ideas. And I think Prince Charles last week used the concept of the Marshall Plan, which has been used before in terms of climate. But we in the West, we in the wealthy countries, have to invest probably trillions in changing the world system. The only way we're going to stay within 1.5 degrees is to fundamentally change our infrastructure and economic political system. And we have to work with developing countries. And we need to invest, we need to partner with them, and we need to have a Marshall Plan, which those of you who don't know was a massive investment after the Second World War, which rescued Europe from complete collapse.
Tony, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, just quickly, and I think I need to reinforce the fact that just the circular economy by itself isn't enough. I think, you know, the concepts of equity still have to be in there. We could just reinforce the same inequitable situation if we're not careful. But I think there is something more inherent in being able to spread employment, spread wealth more widely in a circular economy than there is in a linear economy. I mean, there's a feeling of wealth being raided from one place and ended up in another, and the waste products going in the other direction. So it seems a bit more inherently uneven. But even so, I think just relying on the idea of the circular economy isn't enough. I think you have to put in place as well the idea of equity. I think one thing I would say is that it feels also that the likelihood of labour-intensive work is probably more with the circular economy than with a linear economy. So again, that could tend to even out things a bit more. But actually, this is one of those big questions that we have to really work hard on. I wouldn't rely on just one golden bullet to actually solve everything, but the circular economy is part of that. But we need concepts of equity as well.
And these are big questions, and we've got lots of them coming up. And actually, Tim Rose has just said in chat that we can share these ideas with our friends, networks, etc. But how do we get the current story politicians to engage with practical proposals for the huge system changes that are needed? And he talks about Kate Raworth's donut proposals, which were mentioned in our last webinar as well. But the current UK government is here for 4 more years, and you know, their leadership, where is that going to take us? And with that in mind, I just want to come to Vicky Johnson from Greening Stenning, who had a question as well about the big announcements that were made this week. You know, our government saying that 30% of the land would be set aside. Obviously 26% of it already is for the wildlife, but how are they going to be held to the commitments that they've made to the United Nations and to others? I wonder if we can say, how far do you think our leaders are aware and receptive to these ideas?
Shall I start with the announcements this week? I think the best thing to do is practically ignore them, because announcements have been made before, and actually they've always been let down. In 2010, similar announcements were made. Wonderful things were going to happen by 2020. There were, I think, 20 commitments made in 2010 about what was going to happen by 2020. 17 of them failed. Only 3 of them might have gone a little bit of progress. 6 of them have gone backwards. And so holding government to account by normal means just simply doesn't work. And they'll be saying wonderful things. And already, since, was it yesterday, whenever the announcements were made, they're already being shown up to be a complete sham. And the idea that of 30% for nature, and aren't we lucky we've already got 26%, is a nonsense. And that's counting up everything possible that's labelled as protection, even if it's a paper park. So this whole idea is, you know, it sounds very good at the time. I think George Monbiot did a very good piece in The Guardian today about this, and he was saying actually it could be worse than useless, because it deflects us into thinking that something's happening, and it's not. You know, we're all doing our best, but actually when it comes to governments, they're letting us down badly. Can I just carry on with this theme? Because I think I've been working for a long time with trying to achieve things through the normal methods. You know, being a polite conservationist for a long time. And yeah, I suppose we've done a few things, but it's not really been enough. And can I go back to, I think a couple of webinars ago, that we had a discussion about Extinction Rebellion. And I think actually I might have given the wrong impression by a comment that came back from Liz.
Who's going to ask you, she was going to ask you a question. So you say what you're going to say and then I'll bring her in. So stand by, Liz. Yeah.
Yeah, I must have given completely the wrong impression, because I basically said I don't like the approaches of Extinction Rebellion, but actually that's a good thing. They should be not liked, because actually by trying to be liked and trying to do the right thing, we haven't got very far. But in 6 months to a year, Extinction Rebellion, by applying much more rebellious approaches, has moved mountains. So actually, not liking them is a good thing. You know, we have to move to these areas. But if I don't like what they're doing, I certainly don't blame XR. I blame the politicians and the media who will only listen to those sorts of approaches. So that's where we are. That's what has to happen. Extinction Rebellion are heroes. I think they should be really appreciated for what they've done. I'm not brave enough to do that sort of thing.
And Liz, have you got a comeback on that?
Well, I call for your rebellious nature now. It's the oldies. We've got, you know, young people. We've left them with all this to shoulder. It's the oldies. It's us who've caused this. So I think we have a huge responsibility to get out there to cause civil disobedience, because it's the only thing that works. Within a year, Parliament had declared a climate emergency in this country after the what Extinction Rebellion had done in London. They got it wrong a lot of the time, but we're learning. So I call to people. I mean, we need the CEE bill with citizens' assemblies to enhance our democratic process, because at the moment it's a complete shambles. So yes, I call for your rebellious nature.
So thank you, Liz, and well done for your rebellion that landed you in jail recently as well.
It did.
Not exactly where you wanted to spend your night, but you know, we know why you did it, and we appreciate that as well. Paul, have you got a rebellious nature?
Very much so. And as I get older, I become more rebellious, which is a bit worrying. But no, I agree. And I agree with Tony and Grojo. You know, the time for just talking and nice, polite conversations is over. You know, we are facing the greatest existential threat since the Second World War. And it's not COVID-19. It's climate breakdown, it's collapse. But to answer the question about what we do and how do we change politics, that would take all day, frankly, because it's so many layers. But there's one concept I want to get across, both from a psychological perspective and politics and economics, and that is our whole culture is built on short-termism. It's built on what's called the proximity principle. But we are only, you know, COVID, because it's real, it's immediate, it's something we can see, terrifies us, and we conform. Most of us do wear masks, most of us do socially distance. Unfortunately, with climate breakdown, it's seen as something that's happening in poorer countries or in other areas, something to the future, something abstract. It's not immediate. And in evolution terms, we're hardwired to much better deal with short-term threats than bigger, abstract, complex threats. And this is why we need leadership. And this is why we need to work at every level to translate, to really find every way of appealing to people and really showing them just how urgent this is. But
okay,
sorry,
I'm going to just call on Dr. Jill Sutcliffe, who made a point in one of our earlier webinars about what sort of leadership we might actually be needing. Jill, are you there?
I'm here. I felt it was rather indicative that the group appointed by this government to attend the UK COP next year, which is now, of course, next year rather than this year, has no women in it. Now, when I think about environmental change, rebellious or not, it's women who come to mind. Wangari Maathai, who got Kenya treed and worked with all the local communities. Vandana Shiva, who works scientifically on issues to do with nuclear power and energy. There are many other people doing a lot of good things, and we mustn't leave them out. So currently, Radio 4 Women's Hour is doing a power list on the environment. I've already recommended 5 Sussex women, and I can only encourage the rest of you. We need campaigners, communicators, decision makers, innovators, and volunteers. That's their categories. So just go to Radio 4 and fill in Women's Hour's Power Women for environment. Thank you.
Well, Jill, you tick all of those categories, so you should be nominated for sure. Paul, you wanted to say something about women and leadership in this area, didn't you?
I did. I think I said something on a previous call, and somebody also put in a question about the role of women generally in the environmental movement. And Viv, if you could put up the slide, please. There's some of you, if you haven't heard of it, one of the best websites to look at is Project Drawdown. It's been developed in the US, but it's an international site, and it's one of the most precise and intense collective efforts to actually quantify the changes that we need to make. And we all have arguments about what we should be doing individually, collectively, etc. But these are the top 12 actions that as humanity we need to take. The first one might surprise you, and it surprised me. It's actually changing refrigeration, which sounds utterly boring and insignificant compared to all the big things we're talking about, but is an issue. Wind turbines, yeah, reduce food waste, we get all that. But look at number 6 and 7. Educating girls and family planning. I mentioned this before, but the UN know this, many other groups know this, but it's only when women have far more political power and far more individual power and control over their own birth control that we can actually address population. But it's also about getting women more involved in the environment. Because as Jill said, you know, and for me, one of my great heroes, apart from Greta, you know, is Rachel Carson, Caroline Lucas. You know, there's a lot of amazing women out there and doing work, and they need to be running things. It's interesting, during COVID-19, it's the female leaders who've done a far better job than the male leaders. There's been a lot of research about this, places like Germany, New Zealand. And so it's worth really looking at this and thinking about it, but knowing just how fundamental this social issue is, this gender issue is to everything.
Thank you, Paul. And I'm sorry, I'm reading through things as well in the chat. And there's been, talking of leadership, I mean, you've talked before, I think, Paul, about getting involved in politics, you know, and from a local level upwards, and other people in the chat are saying, make sure you join your parish council, your council, stand for election, get involved. And Millie has said an answer for this short-termism is why we need citizens' assemblies. The general public aren't actually motivated by the normal cycle of politicians. And Nicola, I know that Nicola Peel is here, and she's a woman who's devoted her whole life to trying to change the environment for the better. Nicola, you've got involved recently, haven't you, with the Citizens' Assembly? Do you want to tell us about that?
Yes, I've been asked by Worthing and Ada to do a keynote speech on climate justice. So it's very, very interesting the way that they sent out 8,000 invites to Worthing and Ada citizens, and out of those 8,000, Democratic Services chose 40 people that would represent the Worthing district. So they had to fill in a questionnaire on, what do you know or believe about climate change, and so from that, 40 people have been selected. And Jonathan Porritt, he just did the opening keynote speech, and there's a huge number of people, and what they're covering is really impressive. So they have 5 days where they have to listen to all of us experts, and then they will be asked what they think that Worthing and Ada should be, focusing most on. So it's exciting. There's been a lot of talk about Citizens' Assembly, and that, it is actually happening. And, and hats off to Worthing and Ada for actually doing it.
And Citizens' Assemblies are a fascinating option, and where people are given the voice, they're coming up with the right answers. So, you know, there's real hope in all of that. We're slightly running out of time, which is amazing. We've got a few minutes left. And I did promise earlier on, you didn't see this, it was all behind the scenes, that I would come to Tor Lawrence from Sussex Wildlife Trust, who wants to talk about how we can't sustain a state of emergency.
So Chief Exec of Sussex Wildlife Trust, following in Tony's footsteps, I wanted to say that on a personal level, I cannot sustain a state of crisis and emergency. I cannot sustain it. And going into the COVID crisis, running the organisation during that showed us that we need leadership of different types at different times. I wanted to reflect on the Brecht play, Mother Courage. Mother Courage doesn't achieve anything by just being angry and shouting. She achieves by long-term determination, love, anger and courage. And I'm just asking for us, whilst I don't deny that the planet is in crisis, I'm saying that to sustain change, we need to look after ourselves and to have some resilience to go forward and make positive change happen. So I apologise, I've missed the other conversations, but I wanted to say I've learned that on a personal level about long-term stamina for this.
I think that's a fantastic, beautiful thing to say. Thank you very much for that. I did actually read Mutter Courage, and I know all about that strength. And I think it's very important when people are being activists as well, because people run out of steam and then they're no good to anybody else. And actually we need to be regenerative of ourselves to be able to be effective. And I think what's been fantastic about everything that we've heard in here is the amount of creativity and the different paces that people are taking towards finding answers. And I think that's a really good place to have a final input from our speakers. I'll quickly check the chat before we go as well, and I've got an inspiring person I want to talk to you about as well. But well, shall we start with Tony? Because Tony, this is the woman who's doing the job that you were doing. You know, you're used to those sorts of challenges. How do you get beyond feeling like you're living in a constant state of emergency?
Yeah, I mean that's key, isn't it? And I think actually, well, there's so much to do, but actually you need to think about, well, how do you get that long-termism? And yeah, well, we're all in it for the long term. I mean, that probably is a feature of environmentalism. But actually, I think so. It comes down to, well, what are you going to do? And I started off by saying that you need to ground yourself in something that works. And actually, I'm finding that the way to start is local, where we're failing dismally at a global level with failing politicians in almost every place, it seems. I can look around our local area and see places where there are good news stories. Maybe they're exceptions, but they're quite big exceptions, and there's quite a lot of them. So actually looking locally, looking at your the different ways to influence locally, it could be through something new like a citizens' assembly, but also parish councils, district councils. It doesn't actually matter what colour they are politically, there's good people there. So actually looking at what you can do locally. And I was really encouraged because at the beginning of this week, just 2 days ago, we talked about donut economics. Well, they've just launched the Donut Economics Action Lab, which is specifically for application at local level. And that could be really exciting. You know, we're not going to be able to get much change out of what's happening nationally, but maybe we can start to work better from the bottom up, and that gives us an example of a fantastic tool.
Yeah.
Oh.
Well, it's a great question, and it's something I think about a lot personally, and also in my work, is how do you maintain your positivity? How do you maintain your resilience and your strength through constant crisis almost? You know, for 21 years, I've been reading on a daily basis just how bad the state of the world is. And as a natural pessimist, it could almost push me over the edge sometimes, but I kept going. And what's helped me is, first of all, having friends and people like on this meeting here to share with. You know, doing it on your own is very hard, but being part of a group and being honest and being open and saying things like, you know, it is hard. That's a big thing. But for me, I think the biggest source of strength for me is knowing that it's not about me. and doing it for intrinsic reason, for intrinsic motivation, not because even I'm ever going to see the results of this work in my lifetime, but because it's the right thing to do, not in some religious moral sense, but it feels right to me. And when you know what's going on, you really have no choice but to act. And we're all here to support you.
Well, that's a great note to end on. Gosh, it has gone past the hour, so we are going to wrap up in a minute. I just want to give you a little quote from somebody whose book I've just bought. We've had a lot of book references in this, and I've not added one until now. And he says, with conviction in our beliefs and committed action, with unity, strength and compassion, we will build a world that truly works for us all. And there is hope ahead. I'm living proof that even in the most difficult of circumstances, there is hope. He's a Somalian refugee, lives in Sheffield, became Lord Mayor of Sheffield in his 20s, and he's called Majid. And he's written the book, The Art of Disruption, a manifesto for real change, currently an MEP for the Green Party. And I met him and I found him to be one of the most positively inspiring people who's been through a lot, and I would definitely recommend his story to you, and many of the stories that we've heard shared in this group. One question we were asked, if you can all bear with us just for a few more minutes, we got so emotional there that we didn't remind ourselves to say, what is the future for your better nature? And I apologise, because we were actually going to go into a whole question mark about whether your better nature is even the right phraseology, but let's live with that for the moment, and apologies for Bronwyn, who wasn't able to ask that question, and let's assume that we're staying with our name for now, although language does matter. And I just wanted to ask very briefly Paul and Tony to explain what they thought we would be doing with your better nature, and Gonzalo, perhaps you can also jump in a minute to just explain one of our future plans. Paul, do you want to go first, as I can see you on screen?
Sure. Well, when we came up with this idea, I remember we were sitting in the pub. That feels like a long time ago, in January, pre-COVID and post-COVID, a bit like BC and AD. And we came up with the idea, and it was all about linking the different parts, connecting the dots. That was the idea of Your Better Nature. So we wouldn't just talk about, recycling or electric cars. We would connect politics, of psychology, of spirituality, economics. And we wanted to do this. It was very much a pilot to see how people felt about it, how it went. And we're going to sit down and really look at the future, but we want to take it out to as many groups as possible. We want to work with different people. We want to work with climate deniers. We want to work maybe in people who think it's a Chinese hoax. We don't mind, but work with as many people as possible to get the message out. But we'd love your feedback as well.
And Tony?
Yeah, we see this very much as a start. It's something that, in fact, in some ways, you're a selected audience, which is about preaching to the converted a bit. But that was the idea, to get your feedback about where we can take this. We always thought it would be something we could trial and then roll out further. Whether we go further and actually reduce this to shorter sessions, maybe just one, or maybe a series of 3 may work. But certainly we would like to take this out further, encourage discussion. And the niche I think that we're trying to look at is actually about the narrative, the human story. There's plenty of other places doing practicality, behavioural change, real actions. Important though they are, we're all involved in them as well. But I'm not sure that the environmentalism has actually got the full narrative yet. And that's what the kind of human story angle is actually about. So that's what I think our niche is. But we'll see what everybody says. Should we carry on with this?
Well, we're getting some very positive feedback in the chat, so thank you very much. I'm glad that you've enjoyed being guinea pigs, Janet, there. Gonzalo, are you there? Because we've got a new initiative being planned with you. Do you want to talk about that?
Indeed, and it's quite exciting actually, and it's in view of 2021 UN Co-op 26 being hosted by the UK, and in view of that, the idea that we've got is with the United Nations Association Climate and Oceans is to invite your team with Tony, Paul, and all your team to take this these series of webinars using our national network, perhaps even international one as well, to perhaps even a more diverse public, diverse audience. We tend to reach out a lot of people from other, like London, from different faiths and groups and ethnic backgrounds and cultures, which is quite exciting. So it's an open invitation if you would like to engage in that sort of context, more with lots of even, points of views. North and South, we've got, our network stretches from all the 4 countries in the UK. Probably it could take us forward, and potentially we could even write a sort of a short report that's out of my mind to the organizers of UN COP26, so to have a little bit of influence there as well, because the UN is taking this, and it's increasingly it's the emphasis is in climate action and climate and the languages of climate crisis. We use that language, and published our website if you want to check us out, because Paul and Tony, we have the profiles published on that website. So we are starting sort of, spreading the word. It's an important message, and if we all pull together, we can make change.
Yay! And we love the fact that it started here.
Exactly.
It started with this group of people getting together. Lovely to have you on board and to be part of what you're proposing for the 75th year of the United Nations. So we're going to be growing this. We're going to have more influence, and every one of you who's contributed to this will be part of that story ongoing. So, we'll stay in touch. And as Gonzalo said, you can have a look at the website as well, and we'll start populating that with some of the content. So here we are. The eye only sees what the mind is prepared to comprehend. And our language change, we've gone from a value mindset into behavior change and systems change. We want actually to change and to see our better nature, your better nature, being the story for the future. There's a reference here for the broadcast that the UN did, Urgent Solutions for Urgent Times. It's a really, really good film. I recommend you watching that. That will be sent out to you afterwards. And we're really lucky now to be going to play you some music as we promised. And this is from Roberto in Brighton, who has actually been working on this song with a friend of his, a producer friend of his, since 2008. And the song, Time Ain't on Our Side, was actually finally composed and ready for us to see, published in lockdown in April 2020 on his channel, Supralim Music. So let's have a listen.
And maybe no tomorrow now. Time ain't on our side. And stop, don't say you're down now. Still time to realize there's no one waiting to redeem you. It's just love living right now, yeah. It's all in your mind. Maybe no tomorrow now.
Thank you, Roberto. That's absolutely brilliant. That's just a taster, and it couldn't be more apt if you go back to the beginning of this session and you look at the urgency that was pointed out by Tony. So thank you very much for that. And we are just going to leave you with the final slide. There we go. I'm just going to remind you that you can catch up with everything that we've been doing on YouTube, on our YouTube channel. We also have our Facebook available for you to catch up on different issues that have been raised. And you can see here that we've got Paul and Tony's Twitter addresses, and they will keep stoking up that conversation there. But really importantly, we want to continue to hear from you. We've created a mini little community here of its own, and such amazing people. And you've given your time, your thoughts, your energy and ideas in. And we don't want to lose that. We want to carry on working with you, talking with you, sharing with you. So please stay in touch, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. But for now, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. It's been great.
Thank you. Nice to meet you all. Thank you.
Yes.
Encouraging.
Thank you for all your contributions. Fantastic.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. See you
Bye-bye.
soon. See you soon. Thanks, Miss.
Thanks again. Brilliant.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Cheers.